Okay, good afternoon. It's always hard to compete with beer. So, anyways, so I don't see my talk yet.
Oh, because it's over here.
All right, good. So what I'll do is really briefly talk about two experiments, field experiments that we conducted, targeting two very different processes that both are really important for risk, at least in my opinion. One has to do with induced seismicity and activation of faults, and the other one is about potential water quality impacts from leakage of CO2. I should certainly acknowledge my co-workers. Yves Guglielmi is a professor in France, and he has been very active with induced seismicity and related field experiments. And then the other three, Johnny and Zheng and Nick, are colleagues at Berkeley. All right, so a little bit on induced seismicity. I don't think I need to say too much. It's been in the news and also a topic of scientific research, certainly in the past few years. Essentially, I think there are two concerns about fault slip. One is, and that is probably more related to larger faults and also more easily detectable faults, it's really the question of whether you might induce ground motion that could be at least a nuisance, if not lead to damage. What is probably a bit more relevant, I think at least, because it can happen on smaller faults that might not be easily detectable, is that fault slip can induce permeability and permeable pathways in caprock, and so we might actually get breaching and leakage of CO2. And the major question, in my opinion, is whether and what type of permeability enhancement we might get with fault slip and shear. The second question, or the second topic that I want to talk about is leakage and the question of pH-related changes of water quality in near-surface groundwater. We know that a lot of chemical reactions can happen related to increased partial pressure of CO2. Could be dissolution of minerals, could be exchange or absorption-desorption processes, all of which could mobilize contaminants. And a lot of work has been done in the lab and modeling work, not so much in the field. And there is quite a bit of interdependence both between these chemical processes, but also questions of transport versus reactions and how that plays out in a heterogeneous environment. So, tiny little detour. 5 national labs are actually working together in a consortium called National Risk Assessment Partnership. Now, what we're trying to do is develop quantitative risk assessment methodologies for CO2 storage projects. And so what we really do is compartmentalize the problem, and we do it in 2 bins, if you wish, one going from the reservoir through leakage pathways into impacts on groundwater, the other one going through the reservoir and pressure buildup, then potential slip along a fault plane, and then we either look at the ground motion impacts, or if we have slip and permeability changes, we funnel that into this other department and again look at the impacts to groundwater. And the reason I bring that up is that we've really seen that this uncertainty here and also the impact uncertainty of groundwater is one of the major uncertainties in this entire context. And so what I'm talking about in my remaining 7 minutes and 56 seconds is 2 experiments that were conducted in the field, both controlled release experiments. So let's start with these fault activation studies. One of them has been conducted in an underground research lab, in fact, an old railway tunnel in southern France. So this is an experiment that is conducted in the subsurface in a tunnel, which allows us to get much better access to the actual fault of interest. There will be another experiment next year in another underground research lab, which is referred to as Monterey, and it's in Switzerland. Both of these are essentially an argillitic rock. And I do want to say that this idea of doing sort of intermediate scale field experiments based on tunnel access rather than borehole from the surface access is very common in nuclear waste disposal. It's not so common in other underground energy resources type of research, but there's certainly work starting up, for example, in the field of CO2 sequestration, and this is one of them. So the setup of the experiment is simple. There's a tunnel here, then about 10 meters away is the fault in which a borehole is drilled. Then that fault is pressurized up in essentially in sort of steps. And then that will continue until some slip is seen and the flow rate and permeability increases. And there's additional information on that experiment. I should say that tomorrow in a poster session, T33A. This is a photo of the setup as the probe is launched into this borehole. And of course, because we're in a tunnel and we see that fault exposed in the tunnel, we can take large core, we can look at the inner zone, we can look at the damage zone, we can take smaller samples, and we can do a lot of analysis on that. Now, this is the probe that is being used, and it's a really nice, ingenious device that Yves developed in France. So there's a packed-off section. In this section, you have a very sensitive strain sensor that can monitor 6 components of displacement at very high resolution. At the same time, you measure fluid pressure and flow rate and things like that. So this is a result of one of these experiments at Tournemire. These are the stepwise changes in pressure. At about 1.6 bar, you actually see a strong increase in flow rate, and at the same time, you see that fault move. So that here is a movement of that fault longitudinally along the fault, so this way, and also a tiny bit of opening of that fault in this way. As you stop the experiment, there is closure again, but the slip remains. And it's not a lot of slip, it's 48 micrometer, yet you still see that strong increase in flow rate. And these are some coupled hydromechanical models where Yves and team were trying to essentially represent the results from the experiment. And what they see is that they basically can only mimic those experiments at about 10 to 20 times increase in permeability along that fault, which is quite a bit if you think about that displacement is less than 1 millimeter or much less than a millimeter. So very strong effect. You can also see that the pressure increased area is quite a bit larger than the shear displacement area. I'm very curious how these things would play out over time. Would that fault relax? Would it seal and heal? And I think there's a lot of additional work that can be conducted along those lines. So that's the second topic here. Sorry, I have to rush through that a little bit. So this is looking at impacts to groundwater of leaking CO2. So this is an in situ study where we essentially inject CO2 charged water, dissolved CO2 in water into that sort of sandy, silty aquifer about 60, 70 meter deep. A study site is in Mississippi at a site that is owned by Southern Company. And what we did there is we wanted to sort of control the flow a little bit better than we had at the site because there were seasonal fluctuations, things like that. So we decided to create a dipole. We pumped water out of this well here and about 60 meters away injected part of it here. Before we injected, we dissolved CO2 into that water and then created essentially a flow path with dissolved CO2 from here to there and had a few monitoring wells in between, did a lot of sampling, some geophysics, tracer tests, etc. Remember perhaps that MW3 is about 5 meters away and MW4 is about 20 meters away. So these are some results. So this might be a bit hard to see, but that's here's time. At 0, we start injecting the dissolved water, dissolved CO2 charged water. We inject for about 150 days. And then we see pH drop essentially first at MW3 from about 8 to about 5.5. Not a very well buffered system, so really relatively strong decrease in pH. And then what's interesting is that as we stopped flushing that system, that dipole, as we stop injecting CO2, pH stays low. That's because groundwater flow is relatively slow there, and we have kind of like a stagnant system as we stop injecting, okay? So here are some major cation concentrations. All this up to that line is baseline. And then we can see with the injection that we basically see a pulse-type behavior, an early increase, a drop to perhaps a little more than baseline. Then we stop injecting, and at that point, concentrations start increasing again. That was a little unexpected to us, but keep in mind pH is still down. So we played around a little bit with conceptual models, etc. So what we essentially came up with is that we really have sort of two reactions, one relatively fast, one relatively slow. The fast one is essentially limited pool reaction, so it could be a fast dissolution of a limited amount of minerals, could be desorption of a limited amount of sorbents, etc. That would create our pulse, and then we have a slow reacting pool that at later stages would be responsible for that slow increase. And you see it happen only because the flow rate really goes down and we don't flush our system with fresh water. So if we apply those models, in this case, I think it's a calcite is our fast reactor. Then released calcite will induce cation exchange, and that will increase some of the concentration of other cations. Then we see that we mimic that sort of rapid increase and drop quite well, and then we see that slow reacting pool, which in this case I think it's feldspar, being responsible for that slow increase. So it is important to realize that ambient flow velocity is relevant in such tests. I think I have to stop here, right? Did it? Is that 12 minutes or 15?
There's 15 total, so there's a little time for questions if you stop now.
Oh, I only used 12? Well, that's great. All right, so in that case, read my summary. And some acknowledgement, I don't read them to you, but I should make sure that everyone is acknowledged. Thank you very much.
So since you did a great job with time, we have time for questions.
How much of the increased flow in the Tournemire experiment could be due to volume created? In other words, it's a transient increase in flow. It's not something to be sustained, but it's related to porosity created during that sloping. That porosity then creates volume and then accounts for that enhanced flow.
So I'm not sure I understand your question completely. I was essentially asking Eve the same question, or as far as I interpret it, is that permeability increase due to shear, or is it maybe due to opening of fractures and perhaps even creating volume? So his answers, and he's actually back in the audience, if you want to, there wasn't really a lot of aperture change. And as you might have seen, the aperture opens up but then closes a little bit as you go ramp down with your pressure. So I think it's really mostly permeability-driven flow and increasing permeability due to shear. And Yves will also tell you that he has in that setup a few boreholes that are a few meters away from the actual injector location, which helps him, see, do I see pressure changes? Do I see shearing still there? And that helped constrain the model. So mostly it's not volume increase, I think. It's really permeability and driving flow away.
All right. Thank you very much.